Have you ever walked away from a conversation feeling completely drained? Like someone just siphoned away your mental energy and left you with nothing but frustration? Here's something most people don't realize. Intelligent people are incredibly selective about the conversations they engage in. While most of us get pulled into energy-draining discussions every day, the truly wise understand that protecting your mental space is just as important as protecting your physical space. I've spent years studying Carl Jung's work on psychological types and the shadow self. And today, I'm going to reveal the 6 types of conversations that intelligent people actively avoid. This isn't about being dismissive or arrogant. It's about recognizing when dialogue serves no purpose beyond feeding the ego or stirring negative emotions. By the way, I'm not claiming to have mastered avoiding all these conversations myself. I still get pulled into them occasionally, but understanding these patterns has dramatically improved my relationships and mental well-being. And I've condensed years of psychological research into practical insights you can apply immediately. So in this video, I'll break down the psychological drivers behind each conversation type, share examples you'll immediately recognize from your own life, and most importantly, give you specific strategies to gracefully exit these situations when they arise. Number 1, the validation loop. Imagine this scene. Someone approaches you with a problem. You offer a thoughtful solution. They immediately shoot it down. You offer another solution. They find a reason that won't work either. This cycle continues until you're exhausted while they seem energized by the exchange. What you've encountered is what Jung would call a validation loop. A conversation where the other person isn't actually seeking solutions, but rather confirmation of their problems. It's rooted in what Jung called the victim archetype, a psychological pattern where someone derives their identity from their struggles. This happens because deep in our unconscious mind, we sometimes develop attachments to our problems. They become comfortable, familiar parts of our identity. When someone offers real solutions, it threatens this identity structure. You might think intelligent people would be great at solving these problems, but they actually recognize something deeper. No amount of problem solving helps someone who's psychologically invested in keeping their problems. Think about that friend everyone has, the one who constantly complains about their job. Every suggestion anyone offers is met with yes, but responses. The pattern becomes clear after a while. They're not looking for solutions. The complaining itself is fulfilling some deeper need. So how do intelligent people handle validation loops? They recognize them early and redirect the conversation with questions like, "What do you think would help in this situation?" Or, "What solutions have you considered so far?" This shifts responsibility back to the person and reveals whether they're genuinely interested in solving their problem. Remember, your time and mental energy are precious resources. When you recognize a validation loop forming, it's perfectly reasonable to say, "I understand this is challenging. Have you considered speaking with someone who specializes in this area?" The most powerful approach, though, is addressing the pattern directly. I notice we've discussed this issue several times, but the solutions don't seem to be what you're looking for. What would be most helpful for you right now? Number 2, the shadow projection. Carl Jung considered the shadow one of his most profound discoveries, the part of ourselves we repress and deny, only to project onto others. This leads to a particularly toxic conversation type that intelligent people recognize immediately. Have you ever noticed how people who constantly accuse others of lying often have honesty issues themselves? Or how someone preoccupied with others' laziness might be avoiding their own work? That's shadow projection in action. Shadow projections appear as conversations where someone is intensely focused on condemning qualities in others that they refuse to see in themselves. The intensity of their reaction is the clue. We're rarely triggered by things that don't reflect something within us. Consider that person in your social circle who constantly criticizes others for being attention-seeking. They analyze social media posts, calling people narcissistic or desperate. Yet these same critics often carefully curate their own online presence and become noticeably upset when their posts don't receive enough engagement. The irony, of course, is that their obsession with others' attention-seeking is typically a projection of their own discomfort with this desire in themselves. Intelligent people understand that engaging with shadow projections is futile because the real issue lies in the unconscious. No logical argument can penetrate an unconscious defense mechanism. So instead of arguing, they might gently reflect back with something like, "I notice this topic really bothers you. What do you think it is about this behavior that feels so triggering?" If the conversation continues to spiral, they might simply say, "That's an interesting perspective," and change the subject. They recognize that helping someone integrate their shadow requires professional support and cannot happen in casual conversation. The wisest approach is compassion from a distance, understanding that harsh judgment of others usually signals inner conflict rather than moral superiority. Number 3, the emotional hijacking. Jung understood that emotions aren't just feelings. They're complex psychological responses that carry important information. However, there's a difference between emotional expression and emotional hijacking. Emotional hijacking happens when someone's emotions completely override their rational thinking, leading to conversations fueled purely by emotional reactivity rather than thoughtful exchange. What makes these conversations particularly difficult is that they bypass the neocortex, the thinking part of our brain, and activate the limbic system, which controls our emotional responses. Once the limbic system is triggered, logical discussion becomes nearly impossible. You can recognize emotional hijacking by sudden intensity shifts, black and white thinking, and physical signs like raised voices or tense body language. The content often includes absolute terms like always, never, or everyone. For example, a discussion about household chores might suddenly escalate into accusations like, "You never help around here, I always have to do everything myself." The conversation has been hijacked by emotion and is no longer about chores, it's about deeper feelings of being unappreciated or unsupported. Intelligent people recognize these patterns and understand a crucial psychological truth. You cannot have a productive conversation with someone in an emotionally hijacked state. Their brain is literally not processing information normally. Instead of engaging directly, which often escalates the situation, they might say, "I can see this is really important to you, and I want to understand better. Would it be helpful to take a short break and come back to this conversation in 30 minutes? This isn't avoiding the issue. It's understanding the neuroscience of emotional regulation and creating space for the prefrontal cortex to come back online. The wisest approach is recognizing that timing is everything. A conversation that's impossible in a heightened emotional state might become productive after both people have had time to regulate their nervous systems. Number 4, the intellectual peacocking. Jung identified a psychological tendency he called inflation, when someone over-identifies with their intelligence to compensate for deeper insecurities. This manifests in conversations as what I call intellectual peacocking. These conversations aren't about exchange of ideas, but about displaying intellectual prowess. You'll recognize them by their competitive nature, frequent interruptions, name-dropping of authorities or complex concepts, and a strange lack of curiosity about other perspectives. What's happening psychologically is that the person has attached their self-worth to being perceived as intelligent. Conversations become performances rather than authentic exchanges. We've all been to those dinners where one guest keeps steering every topic toward obscure philosophical concepts, interrupting others to correct minor details, and visibly losing interest when the conversation moves to topics where they can't demonstrate expertise. What should be a dialogue becomes a one-person show. Intelligent people avoid these conversations not because they can't participate, but because they understand a deeper truth. Real intelligence includes emotional and social wisdom. They recognize that someone making others feel small to appear large is revealing their own insecurity, not their intellectual superiority. When faced with intellectual peacocking, they might briefly acknowledge the point and then redirect with something like, "That's an interesting perspective. I'm also curious about what others think about this topic." If the behavior continues, they might directly but kindly address the conversational dynamic. "I appreciate your knowledge on this subject. I'd also love to explore different angles, if that's okay." The wisest approach is understanding that beneath intellectual posturing often lies a genuine desire for validation and connection, just expressed in an unhealthy way. Number 5. The gossip exchange. Jung recognized the powerful role of the collective unconscious in shaping our behavior, including our tendency to form and reinforce social bonds through shared judgment of others, what we commonly call gossip. Gossip conversations typically involve discussing absent people's personal details, speculating about their motives, or sharing information that diminishes them in some way. They're easily recognizable by the lowered voices, the phrases like, "Did you hear about?" or "Don't tell anyone, but." What's fascinating from a psychological perspective is that gossip originally served an evolutionary purpose. It helped early humans share crucial information about group members and establish social norms. But in modern contexts, it often becomes toxic. In many workplaces, lunch breaks inevitably devolve into discussions about colleagues' personal lives, mistakes, or perceived inadequacies. Watch what happens next time. People leave these sessions seeming temporarily energized, but ultimately more anxious and distrustful of the group. Intelligent people understand the hidden psychological cost of gossip. While it might provide momentary social bonding, it ultimately erodes trust and creates an environment of insecurity. After all, if you're gossiping with someone, they're likely gossiping about you too. When gossip begins, they might redirect with, "I'm not comfortable discussing this," while they're not here to give their perspective, or change the subject to something more constructive. If pressed, they might gently point out, "I've found that talking directly to people works better for me than talking about them." The wisest approach is recognizing gossip as a misguided attempt to fulfill legitimate needs for connection and belonging, then finding healthier ways to meet those needs. Number 6. The persona maintenance. Jung introduced the concept of the persona, the social mask we wear to conform to society's expectations. While the persona serves an important function, problems arise when we become overly identified with it. Persona maintenance conversations are those designed primarily to reinforce someone's self-image rather than to communicate authentically. They're characterized by predictable scripts, virtue signaling, humble bragging, and a strange resistance to any depth or vulnerability. You can spot these conversations by their performative quality, as if the person is speaking to an invisible audience rather than to you. There's often a disconnect between what's being said and the emotional undertone. You know the type. People who turn every conversation into an opportunity to mention their accomplishments, their children's achievements, or their latest purchases. Try discussing challenges or vulnerabilities with them and watch how quickly they redirect. These conversations aren't exchanges, but personal branding exercises. From Jung's perspective, this happens because maintaining a perfect persona requires enormous psychological energy. Any crack in the facade threatens the false self that's been constructed. Intelligent people recognize these conversations are ultimately unsatisfying because they engage with a projection rather than a person. There's no real connection possible when one person is presenting a curated version of themselves. When facing persona maintenance, they might attempt to gently shift toward authenticity with questions like, "That sounds impressive. How did that experience affect you personally?" Or, "Have you ever found that challenging?" If the pattern continues, they understand that pushing too hard against someone's persona defenses can trigger anxiety or hostility. Sometimes the kindest approach is simple acceptance that this person isn't ready for deeper connection. The wisest perspective is compassion, understanding that rigid persona maintenance often indicates deeper wounds and insecurities that the person isn't yet ready to address. When we look at these 6 conversation types through Jung's psychological lens, we see they're not just annoying interactions, they're reflections of our complex internal landscapes. The validation loop, shadow projection, emotional hijacking, intellectual peacocking, gossip exchange, and persona maintenance all represent ways we humans attempt to meet our needs, often unconsciously. Intelligent people avoid these conversations not out of arrogance, but from understanding that true wisdom includes knowing when dialogue will be productive and when it won't. By recognizing these patterns, you gain the freedom to choose your conversational environments more carefully. This isn't about avoiding difficult topics. It's about distinguishing between difficult conversations that lead to growth and difficult conversations that lead nowhere. Remember that your attention is one of your most precious resources. Where you place it determines not just the quality of your conversations, but the quality of your life. So the next time you find yourself drawn into one of these 6 conversation types, ask yourself, is this exchange serving growth, understanding, or connection? Or is it serving something else? Your answer will tell you whether to engage or politely redirect. If you found this perspective helpful, you might enjoy my video on the 5 communication patterns that build deeper relationships, where I explore the flip side, the conversations that intelligent people actively seek out. I'll link to that in the description below. Thank you for giving me your attention today. I hope these insights serve you well in building more meaningful connections and protecting your mental energy. As always, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.